There she was, being splashed in the face with dirty handkerchief water. St. Teresa of Lisieux and another woman were kind of washing these handkerchiefs. This other woman wasn't paying attention to what she was doing. And so St. Therese of Lisieux, said to herself, I'm going to kind of step back and, bring attention to what this woman is doing. She doesn't realize she's splashing this dirty handkerchief water in my face. But then she decided to do something very different. Something most probably wouldn't think to do. She said to herself, why be so foolish enough to refuse treasures offered so generously? And so instead of complaining, instead of stepping back and making this other woman feel bad, she spent the next half hour trying to get herself to love being splashed in the face with this dirty handkerchief water. And she succeeded, she says. She says, by the end of the half hour, I had acquired a real taste for this novel form of aspersion. That's when you get sprinkled with holy water. How fortunately to find this spot where such treasures could be given away. I would come back as often as I could. How do you respond to difficulties and challenges, inconveniences that happen? So today is a day of great celebration. We get to come back for public mass once again. Yet for some, it's kind of mixed with, a lot of encumbrances, frustrations, annoyances maybe. You have to wear these hot, uncomfortable masks and, go through all these different, social distancing and all these new requirements that are taking place. How do you respond to challenges and difficulties with grace? We get a little idea of how to do that from our second reading today, the letter of 1 Peter. It's the first encyclical that we have from a Holy Father. And this is a letter written by our first Holy Father to the entire church. And he gives us an idea of how to navigate difficulties. This letter is a great review for all of us. He wrote this originally, from what it seems, to people who had just been baptized. We're going through the Easter season. This is the one to remember that we were baptized with Christ so that we may rise with him. We recall our baptisms. But also today, St. Peter draws our attention to dealing with difficulties, frustrations. Something to think about as you're returning to work, as you're returning to Mass, relationships with friends. How do we navigate all these new things amidst this pandemic? It's a little different. How do you respond according to St. Peter? He says that when you make a defense of the joy that's within you, you're doing things because you firmly believe them, that you should do it. He begins by saying, with gentleness, with mildness, temperateness, being very careful. This is kind of a somewhat unpopular way of responding to difficulties and challenges in our church, especially here in the West. Right now there are some circles where it's really focused on to push back against things, to tell it like it is, to stop, sugarcoating things and point out what's wrong with, what's going on in our world, with our church, with our government, with this, that, and the other thing. And I understand that. I kind of sympathize with that. I'm a convert, came into the Catholic Church, and I read about this glorious church with this beautiful theology, and I came in and I seen all sorts of problems and, people doing different things, and I tend to be the type that lacks sensitivity by nature. I tend to be very, very direct. It took a while for me to learn that it's very difficult for someone to hear the truth that I'm trying to share if it lacks charity. If I'm not careful about how I'm conveying with what I'm saying, that person's not going to be able to hear it. They're going to shut down on what I'm trying to say. In the book of James, we read that wisdom from above is peaceable, gentle. You want someone to hear the truth of the gospel, it has to come with gentleness, Wisdom from above is peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits. James 3:17. So for truth to come across, difficulties in your life, respond to them, requires gentleness. This is what St. Peter commends to all of us in this reading today. Gentleness is a pretty big deal, especially here in the Catholic Church. I was perusing our list of Holy Fathers, list of popes. One of the earliest popes, Pope number 4, had the name Clement. He and many others would take that same name. I think it was there's only a few popes that took other names more than Clement. It's one of the most popular names for a Holy Father. What does Clement mean? It means lenient. It means lacking severity, gentleness. What you don't want is inclement weather, right? Inclement weather is severe. It's dangerous weather. You want clement weather, gentle, calm, beautiful. This is the name that many of our Holy Fathers took, Clement, because it was gentleness as a shepherd is a big deal. St. Francis de Sales, he's known as the gentle doctor. When he was appointed as the bishop, I believe it was over in Geneva, he couldn't even get into his diocese. He had a very difficult time getting into his diocese because of the Protestant Reformation at the time and persecutions from Calvinists. He had to be very careful almost to sneak into his diocese. And he took this approach of being very gentle with the people. Had very few people that were coming to Mass, if any, at first. But through this very gentle way, people started to come back. They started to be able to hear the gospel. His favorite verse, which he quoted often, was Matthew 11:29. Learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly of heart. Through his ministry, through this gentle response to difficulties, to persecutions, to hardships in his life, he was able to win thousands of people back to the Catholic faith. So according to St. Peter, what's the best way to respond to difficulties, to inconveniences in your life? Is it to tell it like it is and talk about how terrible this is? We're going through all these changes and things, and the government's not opening soon enough. The government's opening too soon. St. Peter says to respond to encumbrances, not with harshness or anger or annoyance, but with gentleness. So responding gently. It's okay to talk about these things, to speak up about them, but to do so with gentleness, with care. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on. He talks about that going even further. He says not just gentleness, but reverence. Responding with reverence. Raise the lever of this dignified way that you're going to respond to difficulties. If you're going to say something, to say it with great reverence, to treat others with great reverence. What is reverence? Well, it kind of helps to talk about what reverence is not first. So St. Peter, from our reading, he says that as you're moving forward, do things in such a way as to keep your conscience clear. If you're doing things with reverence, your conscience will be clear. St. Therese, again, who we started with, she says that there was a certain nun who managed to irritate me in everything that she did. Do you know anybody like that? Maybe it's your husband or your wife. Maybe it's your child. Maybe it's your mother-in-law. Maybe it's your priest or your bishop. Does these things that just bother you. And then she goes on to say, she says, the devil had a part in it, for it was certainly he who made me see all her bad points. You ever struggle with that temptation? There's something that kind of bothers you, and you can't help but to see every little bad thing about that person, these things that you just do not like. But St. Therese, instead of focusing on these bad points, she chose to reverence this nun that she lived with. She says, when tempted to answer her sharply, I hastened to give her a friendly smile and talk about something else. For it says in the Imitation of Christ, it's better to leave everyone to his own way of thinking than to begin an argument. Can you imagine that? Simply being quiet and peaceful, treating this woman from reverence, letting her continue in her wrong way of thinking and being okay with that. She talked about praying for this woman when she felt frustrated toward her. She talks about looking for this woman's good spots, her virtues, and offering them up to God in prayer, reminding God of this woman's of her good things. And St. Therese would tell herself, this religious sister who I don't really like probably has incredible humility in things that she has hidden away that I don't see, because of her great humility. And so she would think of this woman, not focusing on her bad points, but looking for that which is good. And even praying for this woman, reminding the Lord of this woman's good spots. This is a way of reverencing someone else. It's this beautiful example we get from St. Therese. And what St. Peter says, how do you respond to difficulties? With reverence. You look for the best, you turn to the Lord. See Jesus in that person who you're having difficulty with. Love the least of these, as our Lord says. He takes it even one step further, St. Peter does. He says that in addition to gentleness and reverence, allow these difficulties, these encumbrances, these challenges to make you into the image of Christ. He says it's better to suffer for doing right, if that should be God's will, than for doing wrong. So things are happening like they should be. The country's not opening soon enough, or opening too soon, or the bishop's asking this, that, and the other thing that's not quite right, or your pastor, or your husband or wife, or whoever it is, to suffer for, allow these encumbrances, these difficulties to mold you into the image of Christ, who also took these sufferings upon himself. Blessed Henry of Treviso was a man of great serenity. People tried to rile him up. These kids would play cruel pranks on him to get him to respond angrily. Yet he always simply prayed for them and responded peacefully. St. John Vianney, the great parish priest, talks about having lots of crosses in his life, sometimes more than it felt like he could handle. But he set himself to love those crosses and to allow himself to be made into the image of Christ. So this is a great opportunity that we're going through right now. Amongst all these changes in the Mass, changes in our world, work, family, relationships, to grasp onto that premier way of responding, allowing yourself to be made into the image of Christ. So what do you do? If someone's making life difficult for you, asking challenging things of you, things that you don't even think, that you agree with, respond with gentleness. Respond by reverencing that person. And if you can't do those things, it's okay to just be quiet for a time. But if you can do this, if you can respond with gentleness and reverence, if you can allow yourself to be formed into the image of Christ, you will have the Lord's approval. You will see that. You will grow in holiness. You'll make good use of this time that we're moving through. That God may be glorified. Amen.